I'm Tori, and today I'm going to be discussing The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. I have a physical copy of this, but I actually listened to it as an audiobook through LibriVox, and the narrator was David Barnett. So I thought this book was interesting. It is very much a kind of Victorian, slow burn sort of horror novel. I've also read Frankenstein and Dracula, and this does feel kind of like it's in the same genre. So if you're in the mood for a pretty quick, kind of dark Victorian tale, then go read this and come back to hear what I have to say about it. So I enjoyed this book a lot, and I wish I could have read it back when it first came out and the story wasn't so familiar, because even though I've never read the book, I'm kind of familiar with the story. It's well known, just like they parody it in TV shows and movies and things all the time, and I was familiar with like the basic outline. It's the story of one person transforming into someone else, and because I knew that going into the story, it took away some of the drama and intrigue, and so if I could have read this book and not known any of that information, it would have been so tantalizing and such an intriguing mystery to try to figure out what was going on. I really liked it that the narrator was actually Mr. Otterson, who wasn't connected to the main characters in any way. It sort of reminded me of reading The Great Gatsby, where the narrator and the main character aren't really the same person, because I don't see that in novels too often. And so because Mr. Otterson was kind of removed from the action of the story, it's interesting, the story unfolds kind of as he is living it, and like the climax... And so Dr. Jekyll's life story has already ended before you find out what's going on, and that was a very interesting way. It's kind of like a Greek tragedy or something to see the story of this man's downfall. I loved all the science fiction-y kind of elements of the story, and it reminded me a lot of Frankenstein, where a scientist has come up with a way to do something, and you don't know how he's doing it, and the story doesn't worry too much about telling us the mechanics of how Dr. Jekyll managed to create Mr. Hyde. Instead, it just kind of focuses on what that means for humanity and kind of poses some interesting questions. And that's what the best science fiction does, in my opinion. I love reading science fiction stories that just kind of make you think about humanity and how we approach the world and what it means to be a person. So I thought the whole premise of Dr. Jekyll's experiment was very interesting. He wanted to be able to kind of separate all of his good traits from all of his bad traits. And it actually reminded me a lot of the movie Twins with Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger, except that is like a comedic approach to it, and this was a very, very serious approach to it. And I feel like this story provided a very good background for Robert Louis Stevenson to kind of talk about the nature of morality. And, Dr. Jekyll was someone who it mattered very much to him that people thought he was a very upstanding citizen and perceived him as a very morally sound person. But then he also felt the need to abandon that and kind of cut loose and do things that society wouldn't have approved of as much. And so at the beginning of the story, really what Dr. Jekyll wanted was to be able to maintain the perception people had of him as being this grand, upstanding person. But then he wanted to go away and not be judged, too. He wanted to be able to create Mr. Hyde so that he could go and indulge his impulses without anyone judging him for them. And, Victorian ideas about morality were pretty strict, so in the beginning, the things that Dr. Jekyll wants to do aren't really all that bad. They don't go into specifics of what he wants to do, but he doesn't really want to hurt anyone. He doesn't want to commit any crimes or do something horrible to ruin someone's life. He'd probably spend his time drinking and meeting loose women and, stuff that now we probably wouldn't consider all that bad, but at the time this book was written was probably pretty sketchy. And it was a very interesting idea that originally Dr. Jekyll had wanted to separate his good side from his bad side. And he had wanted to really have the two parts there. So it'd be kind of like there would be three people involved. There would be Dr. Jekyll, all of his good traits and all of his bad traits. But because he was doing this mostly to indulge his bad traits, that's the side that came out, and that's what Mr. Hyde became. And he never even tried to see if he could have like some anonymous do-gooder come out of the mix too. He just always aimed for Mr. Hyde. And he talked about having fairly strong convictions, and having the good side of himself was stronger to begin with, and that's why Mr. Hyde was so frail and weak. But then, by the end, he ended up indulging Mr. Hyde so much that all of his bad traits came out even more. He started murdering people, and then Mr. Hyde just consumed him, and Dr. Jekyll disappeared completely. So I think that's interesting. It seems to me like Robert Louis Stevenson is basically saying it's important to maintain all of your good impulses and not try to let your bad impulses out. This story seems very appropriate for the Victorian era, where people were very concerned about living an impeccable life. And, this story is kind of a cautionary tale of what happens when you don't do that. And so I think the theory that the reason Mr. Hyde was so small in stature and kind of weak physically was that theory was that it was because that side was not used as much, and that Dr. Jekyll had pretty strong morals, and so his kind of immoral side was weaker. But that was just his hypothesis, and he was doing this whole experiment just so that he could have a way to let out all of his kind of immoral impulses and stuff. So you could also kind of look at this story and say that maybe he didn't really have that many moral traits to begin with. And he talks about how everything that Mr. Hyde did was kind of inside him, and he wanted to do that anyway. So it could you could also interpret this story to say that Dr. Jekyll was just kind of this fake facade of goodness and good intentions that he showed to the world, and that he didn't actually mean any of it really, and he didn't have a very strong character anyway. And so Mr. Hyde wasn't as far off from his core personality as Dr. Jekyll would have liked to think he was. So I thought this book was very interesting. I've been having fun reading Victorian literature lately, so I can kind of see how this would tie into the Victorian view of the world. And it was very interesting to read some just kind of dark Victorian science fiction.